what does the future of technology look like, and how will it impact me as an individual, my company, my community, and society at large? And one important and interesting insight is that the future is here, it's just really expensive. Right? So it's true, right? If you think about this, if you wanted to know what the future of virtual reality looked like, you don't need to wait until 2016 and you buy an Oculus Rift for $500. 10 years ago, if you would spend $50,000, you would get an roughly equal set of devices. It's just really expensive and you probably need to look for it. So keep this in mind as we are talking about, as I'm talking about, like what the future holds for us. Again, like you don't need to be able to predict the future, like come up with these crazy ideas. Most of the future is here. It's just, again, it exists in pockets, it's in research universities, and it's typically expensive. So I want to talk very briefly about basically three concepts, like the what, the how, and the why. So what is happening? How do you make sense of that change? And why does it matter? Very briefly about the what. So we're talking, at Singularity University, we talk about this notion of like exponentials. And it's kind of like an interesting, weird concept. It doesn't make a lot of sense if you're like not super familiar with the term. So let me briefly explain this to you. So a classic exponential trend, if you think back to your Math 101 class, a doubling every time period. So 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, classic example. When you plot it, it always looks like this. It's the hockey stick curve. When you pitch a business in Silicon Valley, the revenue side always looks like this. Right? So when you draw a revenue slide, it always needs to look like this. It's always exponentials. The most famous one is obviously Moore's Law. You're familiar with Moore's Law. So Moore's Law, the number of transistors per square inch doubles every 2 years on an integrated circuit. What's interesting about Moore's Law, a lot of people don't know this. So Moore's Law is 50 years old, and 50 years ago, Moore's Law actually observed the past. So 50 years ago, he wrote an op-ed article for a magazine where he said, I've seen that in the last 10 years, the number of transistors on an integrated circuit per square inch doubled every year, and I believe this to be true for the next 10 years. So this has been later revised to every 2 years, so they figured like the rate of change is a little slower, and it has been true for 50 years. Now, to illustrate what Moore's Law does to us as a society, as us, let me just show you four examples. This is ASCII Red, 1997. $55 million US. This thing is the size of a tennis court, basically the whole room of like full of electronics. Was the very first computer in the world which broke through 1.1 teraflop, so 1 trillion floating point operations per second. They used this at Sandia National Lab to do mostly two things: weather predictions and atomic weapon testing. So this is 1997. 9 short years later, you can go into a Best Buy, buy a Sony PlayStation 3, $499, 2.1 teraflops. So within 9 years, you go for something you used to do atomic weapons testing, which a government commissions, to something like your kids now play Destroy the Planet on their television set, right? $499. What I find particularly interesting is the miniaturization of computers today. So you take something like Pi Zero, I guess you're familiar with this, came out in December last year. This is a full-scale computer. You can plug in a monitor here, keyboard here, a little bit of memory, and you can run Windows on this thing. Cost you $5. Has 191 megaflops. To put this into perspective, for the price of a Venti Starbucks latte, literally a Venti Starbucks latte, you now get the raw compute power of 2.5 Cray 1 supercomputers. And the Cray 1 was in the mid-70s, the leading supercomputer. And one of these Cray 1s has more compute power than all of NASA had combined to put the man on the moon. So now for $5, literally like for the price of like a coffee drink, and granted this is highly overpriced coffee, you now get like 2.5 times the compute power it took us as humans to put the man on the moon. So this is kind of where it goes. Particularly, I'm interested in IoT, connected devices, in this. This is a golf ball, this is a dimple in a golf ball, this is a chip from a company called Freescale. This thing is 2 millimeters by 1.6 millimeters. Has the raw compute power of an early stage Pentium processor and costs you now about 75 cents. And this is 2014, this is not even like, latest, greatest, whatever. What I find interesting about this thing is, this thing single-handedly is the reason why everything which has an electric cord attached to it will become smart. I have no doubt about it. Because you get it for free. like you get it effectively for free, like 75 cents, right? People come to me, it's like I have lots of connected devices conversation, right? And people come to me and they're like, why would I want to have a smart toaster? I'm like, I don't care. I don't want a smart toaster either, but you get it for free. You will get a smart toaster. Your toaster will become smart. The second thing which is interesting about this chip is, it is so energy efficient that you can run it on the battery from a watch for about 2 years. Which means everything which has not an electric cord will become smart too. So you go up to Napa, where they grow wine here. Vintners in Napa have something they call smart dust. They're $10 sensors. You throw them on the ground, they measure the water content in the soil, they form a mesh network, and then talk to a cloud-based infrastructure to tell the vintner exactly when they have to water the vines to get the perfect result. And they're $10. They run for about 2 years. So when the 2 years are over, they don't even bother picking them up again. You just like leave them there and just buy new ones because they're $10, right? And in 2 years, like those $10 will be either $2 or the compute power of the device will be significantly better. So I think that is, in and of itself, literally the reason why we see computers in the billions everywhere. What's important to understand is, and people get this with computers, obviously, like you're all like in tech, right? So the computer thing is not like, oh my God, I've never heard this before. What's important to understand is that these exponential trends are pervasive in other industries as well. I just want to give you an example. So cost of DNA sequencing, reading the genome. The first time we did this for the human genome, the full human genome, 1999, $2.7 billion, 7 years of effort. So it took us 7 years to sequence one genome, full genome, for the really cheap price of $2.7 billion. Now this is a massive breakthrough for mankind, like for us to be able to read a full genome. In 2007, we did this the first time commercially. So 2007, there was a company which sequenced commercially genomes for $350,000. In 2014, 7 years later, we sequenced the first time the genome for $1,000. There's a company out of San Diego called Illumina. Actually, your last class, someone did an internship there or like an assignment there?
We have 2 girls this year.
Yeah, right? So they work at Illumina in San Francisco.
Right.
So Illumina has a machine which is like the size of a big photocopier or a big printer, which reads a genome for $1,000 in a couple hours. This is the steepest price drop we have seen ever in any technology in terms of price performance ratio. So go from something nation states can do it and they can do it once, to something your doctor can prescribe within 16 years, which is crazy. Now, the thing I teach entrepreneurs always is 2 questions. The first is when you look at like price performance ratios, always teach them, ask the question, where will this go? Because clearly, the $1,000 is not the bottom of the line. This is not the end. So you talk to experts and they will tell you that that price will go down to literally pennies in the next 5 to 10 years. So sequencing, reading a genome will become free, or very close to free. And then the second question is, what do you do with this? That's the more interesting question. Well, one thing you can do is, very conceivably, every time you flush the toilet in the future, we will sequence the genome and give you a full health report. Sounds pretty crazy? People are working on this. It makes a lot of sense, right? Like your stool has a lot of like bioinformation about you and the health of your like you as an individual. Yeah. So that works. So let me quickly see if I want to show you a video. I just need to see if my sound works. 1 second. Do we have loud? Does this work as a
It does.
speaker?
It oftentimes music plays. I don't know why.
Yeah, let me see if I. 1 second. I just want to play one thing for you. Let's see if we can get this to work. Let's see. So the other thing is, let's see if we can get this to work. This is a friend of mine. She's an artist based in New York called Heather Dewey Harcourt. And she does something really interesting. And I would like to have her explain that to you personally.
We don't know yet how our DNA might be used against us in the future.
New York artist Heather Dewey Hagborg.
One artist in New York is making 3D models of people's faces, people that she's never met.
She calls the project Stranger Visions. The strangers are people whose genetic material she finds in the sidewalks and subways of New York City.
How much can I actually find out about you from something that you accidentally leave behind?
So make no mistake, Heather knows her biology, but what she's doing here is actually not that complicated. So what she's doing is she's literally picking up cigarette butts from the street, extracts the DNA, which is a very common process like the FBI uses in crime scenes, takes that DNA, runs it through an Illumina machine we talked about earlier, $1,000, and then sends off the data to a lab, which then recreates the facial features, because again, like your facial features are obviously encoded in your DNA, and takes the data she gets back and creates a 3D model which she then prints and puts it on the wall. So we are rapidly moving into a world which will look dramatically different than what we are exposed to today. So here's the challenge though. There's a futurist called Albert Allen Bartlett. He taught at Boulder University. And he once said that the greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential function. So we saw that technology moves on this exponential trend. And we're calling this the linear exponential deception. So here's how this works. As humans, we have evolved, we've grown up in a world which is the observable universe to us is linear. So think about this, like the last 250,000 years, the day had 24 hours. The year had 365 days. Like the seasons come and go in a somewhat predictable pattern, and it's always in a linear fashion. It always is like a very predictable pattern. Our brains are really hardwired to understand linear trends. The way to express this is, imagine you take 30 linear steps, so 30 steps, one after the other. It's super easy for you to imagine how far you get, right? It's like 30 steps. It's for me probably towards the exit sign. It's like 30 meters, 30 yards, depending on what your measure is. You also have a really good sense of how far half of that is, right? It's like, yeah, twice it's half. Now imagine you take 30 exponential steps. So every step is twice as far as your last one. So you go from 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, and so on. How far do you get? To San Francisco, okay. It's good. So San Francisco, from here to San Francisco is about 50 miles. So we'd go from 30 meters to 50 miles. Okay, so let me...
230 or?
Yeah, 2 to the power of 29.
29.
Yeah, very good. But it's not very intuitive, right? It's like, you can probably do the math, like if you know the formula, but even like, what is that? What is 2 to the power of 29? So let me clean this up for you. It's 25 times around planet Earth. It's to the moon, back from the moon, and halfway to the moon again. It's 1 billion meters. So it illustrates two things. The first is, it's really hard for us intuitively, just gut feel, to understand these exponential trends, right? Trick question, how far do you get when you do 31 exponential steps? Quick.
It's times 2.
Yes, very good. But it's not, you need to think about it, right? It's not like, oh yeah, of course 50 times, right? It's like, no, wait, it was like, oh, it's a doubling, right? So it's really hard for us to understand those. Secondly, if you have a trend which was linear, when you have like something which moves linearly, it goes to 30 meters. If you have something which moves exponentially, it goes to 1 billion meters. So if you have technology which moves exponentially, you still think it's 30 meters, or to San Francisco, if you're ambitious. In reality, it's like to the moon, back from the moon, and halfway to the moon again. So here's how this plays out in life. And this is important to understand. So this is exponential, this is technology, this is how you see the world. Now in this curve, in this diagram, are 3 interesting parts. The first is this here. Because exponential trends start very slowly, they inch forward in the beginning. You expect them to be better. You expect technology to be better. Any one of you has played with Google Glass? 2, 3. Okay. So, what was your experience with Google Glass? Like, how did you feel about it?
At first, it was a bit surreal.
Surreal. Okay.
Surreal.
Yeah.
Like, you always expected to do something different.
Yep.
You don't get that. What
Right.
you expected, what you wanted.
See, that's what we call disappointment. So I was at Google when we released Google Glass, and I was running around with Google Glass on the campus for a while. I was giving it to people, And they all were disappointed, and I tell you why. Google Glass costs $1,500, really expensive. The battery life is super terrible, it's like 2.5 hours. The functionality is pretty mediocre, as you might have seen. And you look like an idiot. You're disappointed. The challenge is when you're disappointed, you're dismissing it. When you're disappointed, you're basically going and saying, oh, this is not good, and it's not going to be good. But then technology inches forward and gets better and better and better, and then you come to this moment when Steve Jobs gets on stage and presents you the iPhone. This is not a joke, I was at Moscone Center when Steve Jobs presented the iPhone to the world. I was sitting in the audience, and he does this like whole thing, it's like, yeah, one more thing, and the iPhone, and everybody's like, woo! And there's this person next to me, in this beautiful like business suit, clearly like well-dressed, has got money, pulls out his phone, and it was a brand new Nokia phone, brand new, just released, like easily $800, right? And he looks at the phone and he says, shit. Because you know, intuitively know when these lines cross, right? You know, like a phone isn't a phone anymore. A phone is a mini computer. Like you're like, this is the future, this is the past, right? And then you get into chaos and amazement. This is where you can't even keep up with the world anymore. The one example I always give for chaos and amazement. Anyone from Kenya here? No.
No, not at all.
So Kenya's smartphone penetration today is 7%. So they've got about 95% phone penetration, dumb phones, feature phones. 7% are smartphones. In 3 years, that number is 90%. So all the studies I've seen, in 3 years, all of Kenya is on the internet. I spoke to Barclays Bank, which is the largest bank in Africa, and they told me, like, they see the same data, they're not stupid, right? And they're like, if we are not a mobile-first bank in 3 years, we're dead. 6 months after I had that conversation, Barclays Bank announced that they moved out of Africa completely. They're basically saying, like, we can't do this anymore. It's like, we're not moving fast enough. Chaos and amazement ensues. Massive opportunity for entrepreneurs like yourself, because you are going to build the future. So the challenge is, if you stay on this is your path to doom. This is where Nokia stayed. Nokia's last quarter loss, $704 million in a single quarter, without producing a single phone anymore. Nokia was the biggest, most prestigious, and most profitable phone manufacturer in the world. So here's your first lesson, if you want to say so. And this is kind of like a simplification, and I think it's fundamentally important to understand. Once a technology becomes digitized, it moves on an exponential curve. Everything which is digital starts to move on an exponential curve. The biggest business opportunity for you is if you find something which is analog. If you turn something which is analog into a digital good, it starts to move on an exponential curve. It's really important to understand. So how do you make sense of this? I just want to show you a few things in the interest of time. So one interesting insight, and this is Ray Kurzweil, one of our founders, who formulated something called the law of accelerating returns. So one of the interesting insights is, if you're a critical thinker, you will challenge me on the exponentials. If you take Moore's law, number of transistors per square inch on an integrated circuit, if you really double this until like the next 1,000 years, you come to a point where the transistor is subatomic in scale, right? Doesn't work, physics don't work. So what actually happens is all these exponential trends, they start to flat out at one point. They become S-curves, sigmoids, right? So Ray was interested in this and said, if that is true, how does this actually pan out over long periods of time? So he looked at something different. So he looked at how many calculations can I perform per 1 second per $1,000, which is the economic underpinnings of Moore's law ultimately. And then looked at actual data over 110 years, so the black dots are actual data points. And this is a logarithmic scale, which is the reason why you see an exponential trend being linearly plotted. And as you see, what happens is, as we move from technology to technology, from era to era, we stay on a perfect exponential. And here's the explanation for that. Oops. Oh. The explanation for this is, as we're moving from one S-curve, which flattens out, to the next, they start to stack up on top of each other. So as mechanical computing came to an end, tube computing was starting. As tubes came to an end, transistors were coming in. As transistors came to an end, integrated circuits coming in. And now we're seeing already the next trend, which is quantum computing. So we're very early in quantum computing, but we have another like 10, 20 years of runway on silicon, integrated circuits. But we're already seeing quantum computing picking up. So there's a good argument to be made that this will stay true for the next, whatever, 50, 100 years probably. Which, if you believe that, you can actually extrapolate this out and you can do some fun stuff. One is, you can determine the point in time when you have a computer which has the raw compute power of a human brain, which happens in 15 years. So in 15 years, someone will build a computer which has the raw compute power of one human brain. Not consciousness, it's a different story, right? More interestingly, I find, is you can actually determine the moment when someone will build a computer which has 7.2 billion brains in terms of compute power in a single machine, which happens in 50 to 60 years. So very soon we will come to a world, the meta point here is that very soon we will come to a world where the machines which surround us are smarter than we are. And some people say that has already happened with like cloud computing and the Google Cloud, etc. Right? At least the machines surrounding us have better memory than we are. Right? Like Google knows all the world's events from the beginning of time to now, or Wikipedia does. We don't, typically. But we come into a world where like the environment which surrounds us will look extremely different, super, super quickly. And some say that's scary, some say it's interesting. Another concept Peter Diamandis, our other co-founder, talks a lot about is this idea of abundance. And let me explain this a little bit to you. If you think about something like a book is a scarce resource. If you want to have a book, what you need to do is you take a tree, you fell the tree, you turn the tree into pulp, you turn that pulp into paper, you print on the paper, you bind the paper, you put it onto a truck, you send it to a Borders, and you sell it. That's a book. It's a scarce resource. Our economy, our thinking, our models are mostly built, or nearly all of them are built on this idea that the world is surrounded by scarce resources. Like this, the economy theory we're teaching today is that. Now, once something turns digital, that is not true anymore. Like you take a digital book, outside of the cost of production, the initial writing the book, now the cost to distribute it go down to zero, or very close to zero, and the cost to replicate, to make another copy of it, go down to zero. And they change dramatically the way the world works. So think about music. The moment we had Napster, basically the whole music industry died, or it transformed. So you went from something which was like printed physical goods, like CDs and records, to now $9.99 Spotify, 140 million songs in my pocket. Right? It's true. Like I haven't bought a single CD for like, I don't know, 5 years. Because I have every single song on the freaking planet in my pocket. Or you think about knowledge. When Jim Wales started Wikipedia, he effectively took the world's knowledge and put it into a single place for free, accessible for everyone for free. What's important to understand is, as the cost of duplication and the cost of distribution go down to zero, a lot of people make the mistake and say, this is free, and then there is no business model anymore. I postulate that's not true. The business models change dramatically, and it's really exciting because people who are thinking differently, people who can adopt to an abundance mindset, can think in this way, can actually build really interesting companies like Spotify. I want to give you one example of this, which is, people always joke about this. When I tell you the example, I want to see if you joke about this, because typically people do. So imagine medication. Medication today is like the pills you're taking, or not taking, hopefully. They're effectively a chemical formula, right? It's like a chemical, like a molecule, and that molecule is printed in or put into like a tablet form, and then it's put into a blister pack, and that blister pack is sent to you. Now in the future, conceivably, if you have the possibility to print that molecule, which we are very close to doing, we're already doing in like, again, expensive, but in the very near term future, you might just go to your local pharmacy and or even have one of those printers at home. Why would you actually buy the physical good anymore? The cost of the replication and duplication and distribution of pharmaceutical products goes down to zero. I can imagine a future where your healthcare plan is similar to Spotify. I pay $4.99 or $9.99 or whatever it is, flat fee for my healthcare plan, and every single medication I want and need, I get for free. Because again, all they do is send me a file. Now this becomes super interesting if you're in drug dealing, Or if you think about this, like if you think about like illegal copying, torrenting of music files, etc., right? So suddenly there's like torrent files for like super high, expensive prescription medicine. It's a really, really wild world we're moving into. One of the questions, this is kind of like my summarization of the how, is when I work with our companies, I always ask them one question, which I find is the most interesting question you can ask someone. It's like, how does it, what you're doing today, how does that look like at 10x? This is Google's moonshot thinking. And to make this a little bit more concrete, I can tell you a trick, a mind trick. So we use this at the venture firm I co-founded. I used to run a venture firm back in the day. And when someone, any one of you is currently fundraising, just by any chance?
Oh, well,
You're somewhat fundraising?
for something else, yeah.
Okay, so if you fundraise, you have an idea how much money you need, right? You've got to just throw a number at me. Like $1 million, 10,
A million.
$1 million, okay. So we're a venture capital firm, so we sit down with you and you tell us like, hey, we need $1 million. And you typically have a very good idea of what you need the $1 million for. Otherwise you should not have the conversation with me. If we like you, and we did this all the time. We went back to you and said, this is great. We want to give you $10 million. What do you do?
Wow, that's sweet.
So the interesting sub point here is that 99% of entrepreneurs have no idea. The bad entrepreneurs give you a bullshit answer, which is like, oh, we go into more countries, we hire a few more people, you know, whatever it is. The best entrepreneurs have an answer, but they're really rare. The good entrepreneurs basically say, you know what, that's a really interesting question, let me come back to you. What happens is, once you really start to think about, like, now you've got 10x the resources, you start thinking in a very different way. You start like conceiving the world in a very different way, and coming up with a set of solutions which look different. Then what we do is we go back to you and say, okay, that's great, now you understand the world in a different way. Let's now see how we can fund you, not to the tune of $10 million, but probably $2. So it's a really powerful question, because we're thinking in these systems, and we're trying to optimize within the boundaries of what we know, right? So you know a system, and you try to optimize inside of those boundaries. That's typically super hard, because the world we're living in is highly optimized. Once you go and say, those boundaries I just removed, by doing it at a 10 times scale, you start thinking very differently. So it's a really powerful question if you really take it serious. Not just the ha-ha, we do more, or, you know, sure. But if you go really deep into like understanding what it actually means. So let's talk a tiny little bit about why does this matter. To a large extent, I don't need to explain this to you, but it does matter because the big picture is what really matters to us, to me. So about 20-ish years ago, I read this quote from Albert Einstein, which is, we shall require a substantially new manner of thinking if mankind is to survive. And 20 years ago, like, this shook me. Because I was reading this, and I was reading the last word, and I was like, holy shit. Like, this is bad. Like, if Einstein, who's clearly a smart person, like, says that, like, we need this. And I think there's something interesting and important in here. Like, you know all the problems in the world, like, you know, starting with climate change, which is probably the biggest problem we have faced as a human species, to anything to illiteracy, which is 575 million people can't read or write, to unemployment, where we need to create 600 million new jobs in the next 15 years, water, which is 800 million people don't have access to clean drinking water, sanitation, 2.5 billion people don't have access to proper sanitation, poverty is still a huge issue, 3 billion people on less than $2.5 a day, malnutrition, child dies every 6 seconds. I fundamentally believe that as much as all the trends go into the right direction, so we're actually on a good path. So when you look at life expectancy is up, diseases go down, death through in wars, etc., go down. So all the indicators are pointing in the right direction, and I still think we have got our work cut out for us. And I think that the time is running out a little bit, so we need to be a little bit faster on this stuff. What I fundamentally believe is that we need to think and act big. And technology as a vector allows us to do this. I've seen, and we have the great privilege of working with startups here, which leverage technology to tackle these really big problems, and I see how they can work out. So again, like, technology is not the solution, but it's a vector to get us to solving, not all, for sure, but a good chunk probably of those problems. The important question I always ask entrepreneurs I work with is, what does it take to make the problem go away? The thing is, if you ever heard like Steve Jobs talking about like making a dent in the universe, that's a nice phrase, and I fundamentally believe it's too small thinking. Like I actually think that we need to, like, when you tackle a problem, just ask yourself, how do you make the problem go away? And I want to tell you one final kind of like story. It's a personal story. A friend of mine, she's in our program, Nithya Ramamati, Indian-born computer science professor at UCLA, created, you know?
Next leaf, yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Next leaf,
Yeah.
but they don't.
Oh, they don't? They don't?
No.
Okay, so she created an organization called Nextleaf, which is a non-profit. And I had the great fortune of meeting her fairly early on in the project. And what they're doing is they're tackling a problem which is in 20 to 30% of cases, vaccines in developing countries spoil because of break in the cold chain. So the vaccine gets too warm or too cold alongside the cold chain. And she had this interesting insight. She said, there's these new devices called smartphones, which are getting super cheap. And we can connect a temperature sensor to this smartphone and then basically bolt it onto the fridge so that it travels with the fridge, continuously monitors the temperature, and then does two things. The first is it sends the nurse in the field a text message to let the nurse know if the vaccine was spoiled or not, if the cold chain was broken or not. And it sends the data up to the cloud so that the health institutions can see where it happens. Because it typically happens in the same places. It's typically like one hospital where there's someone like who's cranking them up too high, or one port where they forget to plug them in at some. When I started working with her, she had a prototype, and we funded her. I was at google.org, so we funded her out of the google.org budget, and she raised some money from the Gates Foundation as well. This is about 3 years ago. Since then, she's now in 6 African countries and in India. By the end of this year, she's in every single fridge in India. And in every single country, the problem is gone. It doesn't exist anymore. And the reason why I find this, and we had lots of these conversations, because when she came, she was like, oh, we're doing this little thing. And I was like, no, you can make the problem go away. So make it go away. Make that your life mission. And she, like, by all measures and means, like, the reason why I love her so much is because she took this and ran with it. The reason why I'm telling you this is, and this is the reason why I'm so excited about it, is not that like Nextleaf and Nithya is so amazing, which she is. The reason I'm telling you this is because you can do it. Like, when you see the device, it's literally a smartphone with a temperature sensor plugged into it and a tiny bit of code. It's simple. Like, every time I see entrepreneurs, I'm like, you can freaking do this. And if you can't do it, if you can't write the code or you can't do the sensor, like, you know someone who can. And that's the reason why actually I'm so optimistic about the future, because if we put our hearts and minds behind these problems, we can actually solve them. I have got the weird, questionable, and interesting honor of working with the US Navy SEALs. As a pacifist, it's always really funny. But they have a manual, like a Navy SEALs manual, which every Navy SEAL gets. And on the first page of the manual, you'll find this formula. And the formula is your rate of growth, meaning your personal rate of growth, you as an individual. And frankly, what do you care more about yourself than growing? Like, the reason why you're here, the reason why you do the work you're doing in your home country is because you want to grow. So your rate of growth equals the magnitude of the challenge multiplied by the intensity of the attack. If you believe this to be true, and I absolutely fundamentally believe this to be true, why wouldn't you pick the hardest problem you can find and attack it as hard as you possibly can? Because that ultimately contributes directly to your personal growth. I want to leave you with the last quote. You might have heard this. This is George Bernard Shaw, who said that the reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man and woman. If I could have a wish for you, like my ultimate wish for you, you have to be unreasonable. Because that's the only way we can change this world for the better. We all have to be unreasonable. With that being said, never forget we're here in a lot of these technologies. And I said there's a longer version of this deck, as well as a link to my newsletter and all my my contact information, so my email and everything. If you go to finet.com/yay, and you can just download it there. Thank you so much for